In this session we're going to talk about Porter's five forces, and in particular we're going to look at the problems that new entrants, new companies coming into a market may encounter. Established companies have all sorts of advantages within a market. They have set up distribution channels, they have negotiated with the banks, they have specialist training for their staff, they have secured raw materials. So existing firms have many advantages because of their size. And the new entrants coming into the market may come across this problem of size, which we call economies of scale, economies of being big. Scale means size. So existing companies may encounter that problem. Now that's quite a big topic in economics, and one which will be considered in much more detail later. A second type of problem that companies entering the market may come across is the capital requirements of entry. We may know a company is making large sums of money. We may know companies making a lot of profit, but we can't set up against them because of the capital requirements. If you or I went into the local bank and asked to borrow £100 million to set up against some big company, chances are we wouldn't get it. So the capital requirements tend to be a blockage for new companies coming into the markets. There's also an issue of technological know-how. Microsoft it's a very talented company. It's a company composed of many talented people. They've got technological know-how. They know how to do things with computers, operating systems, software, so on. There's nothing to stop you or I doing it. The only thing that stops us is our inability to do it. So technological know-how can be a blockage, and obviously Microsoft keep their code and their procedures and their methods secret. And that's why industrial espionage, of course, is quite a big issue nowadays. We call some of these things barriers to entry. It's a very important topic, and it's one that we will look at in much more detail in a later class. But for the moment, the term we use are barriers to entry, blockages for new companies coming into the market. Existing companies want to maintain their profit levels. They don't want the profit levels competed away with new companies. So they must block the new companies from coming in. And to do this through barriers to entry, which economies of scale, capital requirements, technological know-how, and there are many others which we will look at in a subsequent class. Back to economies of scale for a moment. What it means precisely is that there is a decline in unit cost, the unit cost of making a product I should say, as the volume of production increases. Diagrammatically it would look something like that. On the horizontal scale we have the size of the company, the volume of output, and on the vertical scale the costs, let's say the unit costs of making some particular product. And an economy of scale would show costs falling off as the output increases. Now, economies of scale deter entry. They do it in various ways. They could, for example, deter entry by forcing an entrant, a new company, to come in at a very large scale. Well, there's a problem of risk there. If you're going to make an investment to join the market, do you want to commit a lot of capital at the start, run the risk of joining having invested a lot of money? And also, if you do come in at a large size, then the existing firms are going to react against you. For example, the existing firms may cut the price. If they cut the price, there's less profits. So you would have invested a lot of capital, a lot of money to join the market, only to find the price of the product in the market falling because existing firms are cutting the price to make it difficult for you. Alternatively, you could of course join at a smaller scale, but of course if you do that, you're at a disadvantage in terms of bulk buying, negotiating discounts, having specialist departments within the company specializing in certain aspects of production. In other words, you're going to suffer from being a small company, and you're going to have a cost disadvantage. So you're not going to make as much profit per unit as the larger firms. Excuse me. Okay, so both of these are highly undesirable. So economies of scale are a problem for new entrants. The sources of the economies of scale, well, these may be through mass production. As I said, we'll deal with these further in a subsequent class, but mass production enables economies of scale, economies of size, when production is standardized. Ford, when they made the Model T car, they had specialist departments making wheels, other departments making engines, other departments making bodywork, and eventually it all came together on the assembly line, and the car was made very efficiently and very quickly. So mass production tends to go with economies of size. Smaller companies do not have the facility to break up production into those small units, generally speaking. As I said to you earlier, there could be discounts on bulk buying. So larger companies have an advantage. The suppliers like to deal with them. The suppliers of raw materials, the suppliers of specialist labour. So larger companies have an advantage when it comes to negotiating in the marketplace for raw materials and for components. Sometimes fixed costs can be spread over larger volume. For example, if you place an advertisement in the press, it doesn't matter if you produce a very small quantity or a very large quantity. You still have to pay the same cost in the press. But if you happen to be producing a large quantity, then the unit cost per item of that advertisement is very small. When you divide by a large number, it becomes a small fraction. If the capital cost is high, the entrants may not have the necessary funds. But if it's, as I said earlier, if we know a company is making a lot of profit, if we know Microsoft is making a lot of profit, how can we set up against them? We have the problem of ignorance for a start, or know-how. We don't know how to do it. But secondly, it would be extremely difficult to borrow the money to set up a company in competition. That would be phenomenally complicated and very unlikely you'd ever receive the funding. So capital costs vary according to the technology and to the scale. Actually, I mentioned Microsoft. In fact, Microsoft, the capital commitment is perhaps not that high because a lot of it is intellectual property. If you're setting up making steel, you may have to commit proportionately more capital because furnaces and large capital equipment perhaps costs a lot more. So the threat of new entrants, well, there's a brand loyalty that consumers have towards existing firms. Customers like existing companies. They're familiar with the product. They know exactly what they're getting when they buy it, etc. And something new in the market may experience some resistance on the part of the consumer. Access to the distribution channel, if that's not easy, well, that's a problem, that's a threat. If you can't get your output to the consumer, then that's a problem. So distribution channels might be tied up in towards with contracts with retailers, for example. So that could be an issue. New firms have to persuade the channels to accept the product. And they might have to do this by cutting prices or giving greater percentages, greater markups to the people involved in the distribution. And all of that, of course, will reduce profits. This, of course, is in a modern sense, this has led many companies to try and sell directly via the internet, which is becoming, and has been for probably the last 5-10 years, has been becoming a potent force in retailing. Okay, expected retaliation from large companies. Well, you can't expect the large companies to sit back and just simply let you enter the market and take their profits. They're going to do something to get you back. What they're more than likely going to do is cut their price. Cut their price could lead to a price war. And you've just invested perhaps a lot, as a new entrant, you've just invested a lot of money, a lot of capital in setting up. Now there's a price war, so you're not making any profits. How long can you sustain yourself in the market? That's a problem. Experience from the larger companies is always an advantage. Knowledge can always be gained through mistakes learned. And if you're a new company coming in, you haven't had that knowledge, that experience. You haven't benefited from learning by doing. You've worked it out in theory perhaps, or on a piece of paper, but you haven't actually done it, so you don't really know what the problem is until you do it. And that's also a problem for new companies. Also, the government can limit new industries through licensing. Licensing can be issued in all sorts of ways. For certain products, only some companies are licensed. For example, the mint that makes coinage, makes our currency. If you start making coinage in the garden shed, you get locked up. The police will come. So the government only approves certain companies to make it, and it's done strictly under license. You can't make explosives, quite rightly, but you can't make them. Only certain companies are allowed to make it. In fact, since the utilities, water, gas, electricity, many of the utilities, telephones and so on, since these are monopolies, and it's more efficient to supply the good through a monopoly. It would be silly having several sets of gas pipes running into your home just to have competition. So, because the utilities tend to be the monopolies, the government has appointed regulators to monitor what's happening within that sector and to make sure that the consumers are not being punished by virtue of the fact that it is a monopoly. So the government controls, or attempts to control, prices and control output as well through licensing of certain sectors. Existing players may also, of course, require raw materials. The existing players not only require them, but they control the raw materials. And if they control the raw materials, then new firms may find it very difficult to start up. They simply can't get the raw material. Okay, that's an overview, just to skim over the surface of issues that we could encounter when we look at new market entrants. So that's another box on the Porter's 5 forces, which we've looked at. There'll be some more available for you. Please look at those. In the meantime, thanks for looking at this one.